right, to wrap up talking about biopsychology, I'm first going to wrap up a little bit about the brain, then we'll move on to the endocrine system, and then talk a bit about genes and evolution. So, I've talked a little bit in the last video about the different functions that different parts of the brain serve, and how, although they have specializations, for the most part, the whole brain is necessary for a lot of proper functioning. And one sort of additional thing I'd like to say about that is that when you do lose some brain function, sometimes other parts of the brain will be able to compensate in ways for that. Maybe not completely, but you can get some compensation sometimes, and the brain can change over time because of what you're thinking and feeling and doing in other ways. So, when you learn or when you are experiencing something over and over, like I've said at the quote at the beginning from Endel Tulving, your brain is literally changing in some physical manner. Whether that is just the activation of neurons when you have a thought or engaging in some behavior, or by doing something repeatedly and learning from it, you might be making new connections. And early in life, this might have to do with neurogenesis, with new neurons developing. But after your brain reaches its final form, so to speak, when you're in your mid 20s, this doesn't really happen anymore. But you can still learn things, and your brain structure can still change according to the functions that you need from it. So even though later in life you tend not to develop new neurons, the axons and dendrites in your brain, parts of your neurons, can kind of move. They can withdraw or retract or extend to make new connections. So you can forge new pathways, or if you aren't using pathways, like you don't think about something or you don't use a particular skill, those pathways might kind of atrophy with disuse, and those connections might be lost in some way. Um, and this, again, is something that happens more frequently in youth. So it might be part of why we have an easier time learning a language when we're young, or why it's easier to learn certain new skills when you're young. But this process still happens throughout life, even into your elderly years. Your brain structure can change as a result of your learning and experience. So not only can the physical structure actually change, but the use of those different pathways are going to change over time. They're going to be more or less strengthened. So not only with learning, but I think an example that it can be really evocative too is with people's substance use abuse and addiction. So those pathways that lead to someone being addicted to a particular substance are because they have gotten so used to those particular pathways that are lit up, so to speak, by a particular substance. And if those pathways aren't lighting up anymore, then that might make it very difficult for that person, not just in a psychological sense, but in a very real physical sense, that their brain craves some sort of stimulation. So those are physical as well as psychological changes. Okay, moving on to a different type of communication that I've mentioned. We've talked a ton about the nervous system, obviously, but a sort of parallel or complementary system that we have is the endocrine system. So these still involve communication from neurons, certainly, but what the endocrine system really is doing is communicating throughout the body with hormones. It's a network of glands using your bloodstream rather than neurons. It's not, sending those electrochemical messages. It's sending chemicals through your blood to stimulate different glands and other things like muscles. To regulate things like your how aroused you are, or in a longer term sense, growth or digestion or reproduction or things like that. So rather than those electrochemical signals that the messages are composed of in the nervous system, the endocrine system uses hormones. And some of these messengers are even the same as in the nervous system. So norepinephrine, for example, shows up in both of these places. It's both a hormone that the endocrine system uses relatively freely, and it is a neurotransmitter that's used between neurons and synapses too. So these molecules get used and reused in different places in some cases. So again, these hormones, they're things that are released by the different glands in your endocrine system, the pituitary gland, your adrenal gland, and all these different parts of your body. And in one sense, it might seem kind of funny that the body has a yet another complicated way to communicate, but this does make adaptive sense. The challenges of surviving and growing, it makes sense that we have developed these two separate but parallel ways of communication. So the nervous system, very quick, very detailed, lightning fast to be able to make you move and use information from your environment, but that may not be as suitable to the longer term things we need to do, like grow and change in during puberty, for example. That needs a longer term sort of communication solution that glands and hormones tend to serve better. So one example of how these things might work in concert is if you think about your fight or flight response when you're threatened by something in your environment. So when you perceive some kind of threat in your environment, whether it's somebody that means you harm or some sort of danger from the environment, you are obviously interpreting that information, maybe visually by your sensory neurons to understand what that is. But once you have an idea of what that threat is, your hypothalamus takes action and stimulates your adrenal glands down on top of your kidneys. And these adrenal glands then secrete norepinephrine and epinephrine into your bloodstream. You might also know these as noradrenaline and adrenaline. And norepinephrine is used constantly throughout your body, and epinephrine is more released in these periods of excitement, but they're both involved. But what these things do is they give you a surge of energy, especially adrenaline or epinephrine, as it's also called. So that gives you an energy surge. It gets your heart beating faster, and it directs more of your body's energy away from your sort of slow processes like reproduction and digestion, because you don't need to reproduce or digest things if you're dead. So you need to use that energy to escape danger before you focus on those other long-term things. So you're shunting blood away from those slow processes to your muscles to be able to move quickly and making reserves of sugar, glucose, the fuel for your muscles available so you can run away or defend yourself in some way. So that's just one example. And this to bring this back to the nervous system, I mentioned how we have in our peripheral nervous system, we have those sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. So sympathetic is also involved in this because that's the excitatory sort of response that's also involved in flight or flight, and the parasympathetic response that kind of cools you down and gets you going more in the mode of digestion and other slow processes and stuff. That's also going on in this process too. Another thing just to mention, it's hard to talk about the endocrine system without mentioning kind of the central hub of a lot of it. The pituitary gland in your brain is sort of a master gland that controls other glands, basically. They're all kind of listening to what the pituitary is deciding in your brain. Your pituitary gland kind of listens to the signals from your hypothalamus and then decides, hey, adrenal glands, you need to secrete some epinephrine or other glands elsewhere in your body. And this is kind of timed out with different processes in your life, like I mentioned puberty earlier. And some of these things depend on sex differences from your chromosomes. So most people have, either a male or female sex. There are, of course, other sexes that don't fall neatly into one of those categories, but the pituitary gland is kind of directing the changes that go on in puberty by releasing certain hormones from different places at certain times. So if you have a big increase in testosterone in your early teen years, then that is going to be some indication that your body is taking to produce the more male parts of your body, your male sex organs, and the types of changes that are involved there. And if you have it's more of an increase in estrogen, then you're going to have your female sex characteristics take place. So the repeated effects of these different hormones before and after puberty too might explain some differences that men and women have in behavior as well. Although we share much more than we have different, testosterone, of course, is very highly linked to aggression, and men do tend to be more physically aggressive. Not necessarily all kinds of aggression, because there are also things like relational or social aggression. But we know that increases in testosterone across our species lead to higher aggression, and men being higher in testosterone in the first place tend to engage in that kind of physical aggression more often. So again, there's evidence that there are biological bases for differences we see in men and women. But it's also really important to remember that a lot of what we might see as differences between the sexes have to do with the social way that we think about sexes and gender. So the really ingrained gender roles that we have culturally and socially are going to put different pressures on men and women and probably exacerbate and in many cases even create those differences that we see between men and women. So there are both biological and social or cultural aspects to those differences that we see. Okay, I want to wrap up a little bit by talking about natural selection and adaptations. And I brought that up at the beginning as kind of one of the guiding questions about our biology and how it fits into thinking about psychology. Just as a kind of reminder, evolution, as we should think about it in this class, is the process of gradual changes in species in the frequency of genes from one generation to the next. So evolution, it's not a process that's masterminded or guided in anything other than trying to it's only guided by the frequency of genes. So the more a particular gene is likely to survive, the more likely that's going to be selected for naturally. So if there's a particular characteristic, like being stronger or better able to find food that leads to the people that have that gene surviving, then that's going to push that gene forward into the next generation. And genes that are associated with negative traits, like maybe being more vulnerable because you have like a visible coloration or something, that might be associated with not surviving. And so that would be selected out of our collective gene pool. And just like we think about animals being pushed by these adaptive pressures, so are humans. And our brains, our bodies, and even our suites of instincts and behaviors are pushed by these natural selection pressures. And the sort of adaptive pressures that we have in our lives to band together socially or to be able to cooperate are things that we have evolved to do over time. Because human beings are, kind of squishy, weak little creatures in a lot of senses. And the only reason that we have been successful as a species is because of our abilities to cooperate and think carefully about problems compared to other species. Like, in the hard, cold world of, trying to survive by our strength or our hardiness, we're probably not very suited to that, but we've been able to do other things to survive. So adaptations that we are making, they have to be three things. They have to be universal, so they have to apply to all members of that species and to many different situations. They must be economical, so they must be, relatively efficient, energy efficient within our bodies, or useful in some way. You don't have some trait that you only use once in a lifetime, for example. It might be something that comes up again and again. And they have to be adaptive in the sense that they are responding to some sort of pressure in your environment, something about finding food or finding and keeping a mate or something like that. So sometimes the adaptations that we have as human beings are going to result in biases. For example, we are taking in so much information at every moment that there's no chance we can possibly actually pay attention to all of it. So we have a lot of automatic tendencies to get around this. We categorize things very flexibly, for example. But that ability to categorize, although most of the time it helps us, sometimes it leads to negative things and overgeneralizations, like stereotypes about people of particular races or other demographic characteristics. those types of overgeneralizations might not always be particularly useful, right? Particularly for the people they're facing. And to kind of maybe take this back to a more, you know, evolutionarily minded way, we might think about this as like perceiving danger or something. So if you're, you know, in the ancestral environment and you're walking around and you see a long skinny object, you might be wary that that's a snake, which would be very dangerous if it is poisonous and you'd want to avoid it. So we might be very likely, if we see any long skinny object, to kind of jump away from it. And that type of error in the direction of being more conservative and afraid of it is going to cost relatively little, to be like scared of all things, even if they're just sticks. But if you're biased in the other direction, like you're not as worried when you see long, skinny things, then you're more likely to have a very, very costly error there. Because if you aren't afraid of those long, skinny objects, you're more likely to be bit by a poisonous snake and die. So we have these overgeneralization errors in the sense that we are our biases are kind of pushed in the direction that's going to be more likely to help us survive in the long run. So it's also important to remember that we, as a species, have changed very quickly in how we kind of manipulate our environment. And we're adapted to a social environment from tens of thousands of years ago, where we were in groups of maybe 50 to 60 people, and we never met anyone that probably had a different skin color, and we never traveled more than maybe 20 miles away from where we were born. So we're adapted to that different and in many ways harsher environment. So a lot of the behaviors that we have might not really be suited to the world that we inhabit. So you know, things like social media or mass media or, you know, political parties and stuff that are really large, we're not really evolved to deal with those things properly, which might sometimes be why they don't have ideal outcomes for us in many ways. But we'll talk a little bit more about some things that have to do with that later in the semester too. So when you talk about evolution, it's important to remember that it's not operating at the level of a person, it's operating at the level of genes. So genes and the information that is held within them is what enable natural selection. The genes that are helping people survive are going to, again, be more likely to be passed on to one's offspring. And that is the mechanism here that leads to natural selection. And mutations are spontaneous changes in these genes that occur when genes are reproducing as someone has offspring or as they grow. So the variety that comes from these different mutations are going to give rise to unique traits. And when new traits are introduced that are more adaptive or more likely to lead to people surviving, those are going to be selected for and pushed forward into a species. So how heritable is a trait is a very common question in psychology. We want to try to figure out, or in biology more broadly, but how we want to figure out, is something actually due to genes? You hear very often this question, is it nature versus nurture? Nature being something natural about our biology, nurture being something about our social environment. And hopefully at this point, you're kind of understanding that that's a silly question. It's almost always nature and nurture interacting with one another. But, you know, some things have a stronger genetic basis than other things do. So heritability in general is an estimate about how heritable about how much of a trait has to do with genes, basically. Estimate of the variance of a trait that has to do with how people are communicating that information through the generations with genes. And the way that we might study that is by using something called twin studies, because there are different types of twins that lead to some really interesting sort of tricks you can do statistically. Monozygotic twins, you might know as identical twins, share 100% of the same genes. They're from the same fertilized egg that splits into two different people. The other type of twins, dizygotic or fraternal twins, come from two separate fertilized eggs. So they share only about 50% of their genes just like any other siblings. So if you study the different traits that people share, that when they're identical versus fraternal twins, then you can estimate how heritable a trait is. So if you see a trait that monozygotic or genetically identical twins share at a higher rate than dizygotic twins, then that's something that probably has a high genetic heritability. If they share them about the same rate, then maybe the heritability is lower, and it's something that's more due to the environment that somebody is in. Other types of studies that you might use to look at this are adoption studies. So do children resemble their biological or their adoptive parents more? It might help you understand these different pressures, but you might also be able to combine these types of studies into twin adoption studies. So twins that might be separated at birth, and you can think about how similar identical and fraternal twins are that are reared apart versus reared together. And it's from studies like these that we know that IQ and other ways you might think about intelligence is about 70% due to genetics, but there's still quite a bit of room there for environmental things to influence that as well. Other things that we might notice are very highly heritable. Personality, temperament, even the choice of occupation or hobbies and attitudes about social things. This correlation is about the same in twins raised apart as together. So we can tell from those that they are very heritable things, because we would expect them to be higher in twins that were raised together if there weren't such a strong genetic component. Even when people are apart with the same genes, they develop in much the same way. So there's a high heritability there. I want to be very careful as I wrap up, though, to mention that it can be very tempting to think of, like, well, what's the gene for being happy, or the gene for being outgoing, or the gene for being intelligent. And that's an oversimplified way of looking at genetics. It's convenient and it's tempting, but it's really incorrect, because most things that we would be interested in human behavior and traits is going to be very, very complex in all the different genes that are contributing to it. So even if you think about simple physical characteristics like hair color or eye color, we might think about those as being, simple combinations of your parents' genes, but even those are much, much more complicated than you might have learned about in, like high school biology or something like that. So for types of behaviors like the tendency that you have to be scared or less scared of long, skinny objects that you might mistake for snakes, that's a very complex set of genes that's leading to that tendency in one direction or the other. Although the combination of genes that's going to lead you to be more wary versus less wary of objects like that is going to be selected for. It's also really important to note that genes don't always express themselves in the same way. They need the opportunity to express themselves. So genes are very much influenced by your environment. You might have people that are malnourished or don't have good social support, where their genes for intelligence, for example, might not be able to express themselves because they are not supported or given the proper chances to show those behaviors, right? So your environment and your experience really affect how your genes express, and that can even affect into future generations. And I'm not going to show this video, not to make this this particular lecture any longer, but in the slides you should click the hyperlink for the video I have there, and that explains this idea called epigenetics, how variation in gene expression is dependent on your environment and your social situation, how that happens in mice. Very interesting video. All right, I'm going to wrap up biopsychology there.